The modern lesson is from Robert Greenleaf from the work Servant Leadership, A Journey into the Nature of Legitimate Power and Greatness. Ego focuses on one's own survival, pleasure, and enhancement to the exclusion of others. Ego is selfishly ambitious. It sees relationships in terms of threat or no threat, like little children who classify all people as nice or mean. Conscience, on the other hand, both democratizes and elevates ego to a larger sense of the group, the whole, the community, the greater good. It sees life in terms of service and contribution, in terms of others' security and fulfillment. From 1 Kings. Rehoboam went to Shechem, where all Israel had come to make him king. When Jeroboam, Nabat's son, heard the news, he returned from Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. The people sent and called for Jeroboam, who along with the entire Israelite assembly went and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made the workload very hard for us. If you will lessen the demands your father made of us and lighten the heavy workload he demanded from us, then we will serve you." He answered them, "Come back in 3 days." So the people left. King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon when he was alive. "What do you advise?" Rehoboam asked. "How should I respond to these people?" "If you will be a servant to this people by answering them and speaking good words today," they replied, "then they will be your servants forever." But Rehoboam ignored the advice the elders gave him and instead sought the counsel of the young advisors who had grown up with him and now served him. "What do you advise?" he asked them. "How should we respond to these people who have said to me, 'Lighten the workload your father demanded of us'?" The young people who had grown up with him said to him, "This people said to you, 'Your father made our workload heavy. Lighten it for us.' Now this is what you should say to them. 'My baby finger is thicker than my father's entire waist. So if my father made your workload heavy, I'll make it even heavier. If my father disciplined you with whips, I'll do it with scorpions." Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam on the 3rd day, just as the king had specified when he said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king then answered the people harshly. He ignored the elders' advice and instead followed the young people's advice. He said, "My father made your workload heavy, but I'll make it even heavier. My father disciplined you with whips, but I'll do it with scorpions." The king didn't listen to the people because this turn of events came from the Lord, so that he might keep the promise he delivered through Ahijah from Shiloh concerning Jeroboam, Nabat's son. When all Israel saw that the king wouldn't listen to them, the people answered the king, "Why should we care about David? We have no stake in Jesse's son. Go back to your homes, Israel. You'd better look out after your own house now, David." Then the Israelites went back to their homes, and Rehoboam ruled over only the Israelites who lived in the cities of Judah. Here are Spirit-filled words that invited us to wonder. Spirit, reveal yourself in them, and through words spoken here.
So, of course, not surprisingly, today I'll be focusing on leadership, about what it means to be a leader, especially as a Christian leader. And because of this topic, this whole week I've sort of been thinking about the nature of leadership and how odd it might have seemed to some in my earlier life, in my youth, in my childhood, that I might find myself as a leader of a church, much less a leader of anything. You see, I was quite an incredibly shy guy in school. I didn't participate much in the life of the school. I didn't belong to sports teams. I didn't belong to school clubs or anything that you would find in most schools. Now, of course, if you don't participate in these group activities, you have no real chance to rise as a leader. And so my reputation in high school was a quiet guy who stayed to himself, was a bit of a religious nut, and had a few friends that he hung out with, right? And these friends were most decidedly not the cool kids in the school. But there was one area I was very active in, really active, and surely it's not a surprise to any of you. It was, of course, the church, both in youth group and sometimes when the youth group did not exist, because I went to some pretty small churches, I was oftentimes, the only church. Sometimes the only active church in the youth in my church. That was, I think, of Bethany Baptist Church in Milam, Texas, which was literally a crossroads in rural Texas. Now, I was a natural leader in that setting in church, but not elsewhere. And for the most part, I have shied away from taking any kind of leadership positions outside the church. And that has not been surely the case the last 15 or so years when I began kind of taking on more kind of leadership roles outside the church and nonprofit boards and social justice agencies and stuff like that. Now, of course, leadership, leading people, leading an organization, leading a business or whatever, it's always contextual. It's always of a moment, of a place, and a time. I've seen otherwise brilliant, charismatic church leaders fall apart when questioned or challenged by their congregations. And I've seen quiet leaders rise to the occasion under the same circumstances. As a pastor in our tradition, where you, the congregation, are the ultimate rudders of this ship, the ultimate leaders of this church, I've shaped my own leadership style by asking the questions that Eugene Peterson gives in a wonderful book on pastoral leadership. Peterson says that we pastors need to keep asking ourselves these two fundamental questions. First, who are these people that I pastor, that I shepherd? And to continue to ask myself that question throughout my ministry in a place. And the second question is this: how can I help these people be the people that God has called them to be? Not what I want you to be, what I want them to be, but who I think God has most obviously called them to be. Now, discerning the answer to those questions is not always easy, and how to help you be what I think God has called you to be has been oftentimes been an exercise in failure on my part. I often say that most of my ministry has been about all the ideas, the programs, and the groups that I helped form or shepherd in that did not work. 80% of all the things I've tried over 21 years of ministry didn't really work, or have not had the kind of impact I and others had hoped for. I always think of myself as a failure in many ways. I don't mean literally that. I'll get you a sense of that, what I mean by that. I don't think badly about these failures that I've had, these ideas. I thought, let's do this, and it fell apart, right? I don't feel that, because trying and sometimes failing, or most of the time failing, is part of what it means to be a leader. You try, you fail, we try, we fail, and then we try something else, and then every once in a while, it works. It impacts us, it impacts the larger world and the community in ways that we had hoped for. To be frank, all of that failure has made me think that most of my ideas about leadership are not about what one should do, but what about what one should not do. There's an ancient method of understanding God called the via negativa, which attempts to discern who God is by and what God is not. And what is left over is what God is and who God is. That's the leadership wisdom I think I pass off to new clergy when they come here to do their internships or to be mentored by me, because I'm not always sure I can always advise a would-be pastor on what to do, but I have a whole slew of ideas about what she or he shouldn't do, right? I suspect if you ask Veronica and others like Josh about what they remember during their mentorships of them, my mentorship of them, it will likely my advice on what not to do and how not to lead. So with all this amazing wisdom born of failure I have about what not to do as a leader, I want to point out how not to begin your time as a leader, of how not to begin your reign as a king, though pastors are not kings or queens, especially in our faith tradition. I think I have some good advice for what not to do in beginning any kind of leadership gig, but it is especially good advice if you've got to follow King David and his son Solomon, guys who had a mixture of good and bad traits, but for whatever their bad traits, they had clear leadership styles. And ironically, their leadership, the first two kings of Israel, would essentially be the highlights of the monarchy for the people of Israel over the next 300 years. It started great, folks, and then just kind of fell apart. You've got this guy named Rehoboam, who's one of the many sons of Solomon, who's been crowned king of all the tribes of Israel after his father's death. And then you've got a potential competitor to the throne in Jeroboam, who had been on the run from Solomon, who had been told by a prophet that Jeroboam would take the kingdom away from his son Rehoboam. Get those names right, folks. Right? Jeroboam returns from his exile in Egypt now that Solomon is dead, and he and his fellow countrymen from the northern tribes of Israel, they go to meet with this new king Rehoboam. And at this meeting, The people asked the new king to reverse some of his father's worst policies, policies that forced the people to work essentially for free on the palaces and the public works of the kingdom. Solomon may have been wise in many ways, but he was a fool in so many other ways. And this forced servitude had caused deep resentment towards the throne, especially among the tribes that were not directly connected by family to David and Solomon, all the tribes that were not the tribe of Judah. Now, to his credit, Rehoboam listens to the pleas of the northern tribes. And then also to his credit, he gets advice, first from the elders and then from his close network of friends. Now, the elders wisely tell him to ease the load, folks. Give the people a break from this back-breaking public service, almost slavery that you have put them in to the kingdom. Tell them good words. Do the right thing. They will be your people forever if you lighten the load. They will forever be grateful and loyal to you. And then Rehoboam hears from his friends, does mention they're young, who give him the opposite advice. Show your power, your inflexibility. They ask for mercy, give them none, and increase the demands of their labor. Now, so far, Rehoboam has gotten two characteristics of being a leader right. First, you listen to your people, and number two, you ask advice from others. Now, listening to people, listening to good advice are good things, or at least to advice are good things. But then, of course, there's something else. Choosing to follow the obviously wrong advice is bad. To not have the wisdom of his father in this case, to choose arrogance over mercy, not a good move, folks. He tells the people that not only will he not lighten their load, but the whip that he had been used on them metaphorically and sometimes literally will be exchanged for a scorpion, which was a different kind of whip that was even harsher on the body than the ones that were being used on them at that time. Leaders don't just listen to people, but they act on what they hear, especially when their people are asking for what seems more than reasonable. But not Rehoboam, not him. And his decision to listen but not hear his people eventually causes him to lose half of his father's kingdom. Actually, more than half, because the northern tribe, the northern kingdom, are the 10 tribes. They go off on their own. They call themselves, well, they don't call themselves this. They call themselves Israel. And the southern tribe is basically Judah, right? So 10 tribes go north. He loses all of the tribes of the north. And sometimes Benjamin actually hangs out with Judah, but it's a wobbly tribe, this tribe of Benjamin. That's a whole other story. The irony is that both kings, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, end up being kind of disasters. And one could argue that the whole history of the monarchy among the Jewish people was in fact a disaster. The people cried out for a strong hand in the time of Judah, or in the time of Judges. It was something God had resisted and warned them about. I will be your king. You don't need a human king. I will be your king. But eventually, he gave in to the people. And 300 years later, there would be no kingdom and very few good kings to be lauded in the histories of the northern and southern kingdoms. Often people cry for a strong hand, so to speak, in a leader, but then find themselves regretting that desire when that strong hand is turned on them. Seriously, though, how did Rehoboam get it so wrong when he did so much right, at least at the beginning stages of our story today? How could he have misread the room so badly, so to speak? Surely he got bad advice from his friends, but he also got good advice from the elders, those with some experience around human nature and what was needed to lead a people. Well, I think the obvious problem was that he profoundly misunderstood what it actually meant to be a good leader. That he thought leadership was about having power over people instead of having power with people. Some of you may have heard the name of Robert Greenleaf, whose fame came to him as a management guru after working for years and years at AT&T. And he developed a theory of management that he called servant leadership, which became popular in some business circles. A convert to Christian Quakerism in his midlife, Greenleaf emphasized a leadership theory that emphasized the leader as a servant of the people that he led. He was actually reading Hermann Hesse's book, The Journey to the East, a piece of which he recounts in the following passage. In the story, we see a band of men on a mythical journey. The central figure of the story is a guy by the name of Leo, who accompanies the party as the servant who does their menial chores, but who also sustains them with his spirit and his song. He is a person of extraordinary presence. All goes well until Leo disappears. And then the group just falls into disarray, and eventually the journey is abandoned. They cannot make it without their servant Leo. The narrator, one of the party, after some years of wandering, finds Leo and is taken into the order that had eventually sponsored the journey, had earlier sponsored the journey. And there he discovers that Leo, whom he had first known as a servant, was in fact the titular head of the order, its guiding spirit, a great and noble leader. Now, from this story and other research, Greenleaf delineated the roughly 10 characteristics of what it means to be a servant leader: listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to the growth of a people, and then building community. Now, to be clear, he's not saying that any leader has all of these 10 characteristics, these traits, but that to be an ethical and effective servant leader, you must at least strive for embodying and enacting each of these ways of being. So with the prism that we get from Greenleaf, who says he derived much of his ideas from his personal faith, you can see why Rehoboam fails so spectacularly as a leader. He may listen to others, but he has no empathy. He has no sense of the foresight, no sense of stewardship for that which he had been given, a kingdom of people he was meant to serve, not dominate and oppress. The few leaders in the northern and southern kingdoms who might be considered successes strove to be ethical leaders, to be faithful to their God and their people. But it must also be noted that it is very hard to be the kind of servant leader that Robert Greenleaf envisions for the corporate world or anywhere else, since so many of the marks of effectiveness in corporate life, in other places as well, don't have anything to do with being an ethical leader, but one who produces profits and desired outcomes. It even affects church life. So many recent gifted leaders in this area, the city of Chicago alone, successful pastors that have 20,000 members in their congregation, have so recently fallen from their positions because of ethical lapses. What does it mean to be a success in corporate life, or as a teacher, or as a small business owner, or even a leader within your family? Is it about outcomes? Is it about the dollar bottom line? It's a test of your students, test scores of your students, the financial, social, and educational success of your family, your children. I mean, even pastors struggle with measuring themselves by the numbers, thinking that others must measure them that way as well. I was talking to one of the fellow jurors at a trial that I was a participant in a few months ago. You guys probably remember when I talked about that a few months ago. And when he found out I was a pastor, he actually asked me, "Do you pastor a large church?" I said, "No, it's a small church on the north side of Chicago." And I wanted to say like 85% of all the churches in Christendom, actually. But you could see that he was not very impressed that I did not lead a large congregation. Or maybe that was just me misreading his when I told him how small my congregation was that I serve. We all take in the messages of our culture, and almost all of us measure ourselves and others sometimes by everything we probably shouldn't, by the marks of measurable success, the dollars, the numbers, the acceptances to good schools, the achievement of our children. And yet, as Rehoboam quickly found out, what people really want is thoughtful and ethical leadership, or at least healthy people do. Right? Despite our inability to sometimes measure our own selves by that very standard that we want in leaders. You do it, we do it. We want our kids to be good, kind, thoughtful, but we also kind of want them to make it. And by make it, we kind of mean by any measure of financial and social success. I don't think it's a bad thing to want our kids to be successful financially and socially, but it cannot supersede what we really should want for them and for us. And that is to be the people who are kind and just. As a pastor, when I find myself measuring myself against the successes of others, and I do it all the time, I have to keep reminding myself over and over again that in the end, my life will be ultimately measured by my faithfulness to God and to the people that I serve, you. and every congregation I have ever led over the last 20 years and will in the next 20 years. So what does it mean to live a life that uses a different standard than the one given to us by our larger culture? I think it means a radical reshifting of our lives, a radical reorienting of our lives around what matters most. Faithfulness to God and to the people around me, and even faithfulness to people beyond my close circle. It means thinking that how I get somewhere is more important than whether or not I get there at all. That means that the way we do anything is more important than whether or not we actually get to the goal. Means matter more than even mission. How we get there is more important than whether we get there or not. How we get there matters more than achieving the goal itself. I think of Jesus, and the reality is that by any measurement, he was not a success. The crowds that initially followed his every word soon abandoned him, and he was left with a small group of disciples who eventually even denied they even knew of him at his very hour of death. By the world's standards, by our culture's standards, he is a loser, a complete loser. And yet his whole life was focused on living and breathing the mantra of loving God and loving others. And one can say, no matter how few people remain by his side at the end, that he did it right. He did it right. That he lived a life worth living. He lived an ethical and generous life. Of course, the other side of that life, the part about the resurrection on the other side of death, is what comes out of a life that is well lived. A life rooted in trying to do the right thing by God and by others. A life lived as a servant of God and of others. When it is done in a healthy and whole ways, because it can be done in unhealthy ways, right? In a way that honors that we are to love others as much as we love ourselves, and loving ourselves is part of that process as well. That kind of life actually means something to God, and of course, but perhaps just as importantly, to the people we lead and love and serve. In the Jewish tradition, and you often see this in, I kind of noticed it over the last couple of years, you often hear words of comfort to those who have had parents or somebody pass away in their family. You often hear these words of comfort. May her memory always be a blessing to you. May her memory always be a blessing to you. I love that. I love that better than my condolences. May her memory be a blessing to you. That is all that really matters in the end. That we were a blessing to others. And whatever way we did, with whomever we did it with. No one will ever say that about Rehoboam, that he was a blessing to his people. But hopefully, others will be able to say that of each of us, that we were, in the end, a blessing to them and to the world around us. Amen. Friends, join me in prayer. Gracious and living God, we thank you for the blessing that you are, and we ask that we somehow, in the way we live, the way we serve, that we become a blessing to you, to the world that you have given us, to the people that we love and the people we struggle to love. You are a God who indeed gives all good things. Help us to be yet another good thing. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.